Look around you. The spaces we inhabit every day, the very air we breathe within them, often whisper truths we're trained not to hear. Especially the spaces of our education. For generations, we've been told school is the golden gate to opportunity, the crucible where individual potential is forged into destiny. But what if the very architecture, the rigid schedules, the constant evaluation, what if these elements aren't just features of a benign learning environment, but deliberate designs serving a far more profound, and perhaps unsettling, purpose? Observe closely. Rooms arranged in linear, unyielding corridors. Constant, subtle surveillance, the teacher's gaze, the omnipresent camera, the watchful eyes of peers. Punishments for unauthorized movement, for speaking out of turn. Sirens, bells, rigidly marking time, segmenting our existence into quantifiable chunks. Doesn't it strike you as remarkably similar to the blueprints of factories, the layouts of prisons, the ordered wards of psychiatric hospitals? This isn't some accidental coincidence. As the philosopher Michel Foucault meticulously demonstrated, this is the very blueprint of modern disciplinary discipline and punish. Foucault revealed how these seemingly disparate institutions, schools, factories, prisons, share a foundational, unstated goal, to cultivate what he termed docile bodies. Individuals who are simultaneously economically useful, productive gears in the vast machinery of commerce, and politically submissive, unlikely to challenge the status quo. The school evaluation system, with its veneer of objectivity and meritocracy, is not merely a tool for measuring knowledge. It's a sophisticated, almost alchemical, mechanism of ranking. Grades, classifications, percentiles, they don't just assess what you know. They fundamentally inscribe onto your very being, your body, your nascent mind, your relative market value in the grand human exchange. That numerical classification of your early intellectual life isn't just an academic record. It's arguably your first existential bank statement. The document that supposedly quantifies your intrinsic worth within the larger social scheme. This insidious quantification of human value, beginning in childhood, psychologically primes young people to later accept the quantification of their time, their energy, their very creativity in the adult labor market. The relentless discipline of time, a central, unavoidable element of the school experience, lays the groundwork for the labor alienation of adulthood. When children learn they must suppress basic bodily needs, hunger, thirst, the urge to move, until the appropriate time, rigidly dictated by the bell, they are learning the first profound lesson in the commodification of their own biological rhythms. They are being trained to compartmentalize their very being, preparing them for a life where their most fundamental needs are subordinated to the clock, to the demands of the system. This mantra, repeated with almost religious fervor throughout our educational system, represents perhaps the most powerful tool of social control ever devised. The unwavering belief in individual merit as the primary determinant of economic destiny flies in the face of overwhelming social evidence, yet it persists as a secular article of faith. This perspective, radically opposed to the incisive analyses of Foucault and Nietzsche, places sole responsibility for socio-economic position squarely on the individual. It cunningly obscures the vast, complex web of structural and historical factors that truly determine life. Social mobility paint a disconcerting picture. A child's economic destiny is, with frightening precision, predominantly determined by the zip code where they were born, by the inherited wealth of their family, and by their parents' professions, not primarily by their raw talent, their diligent effort, or some elusive individual merit. Longitudinal research consistently confirms that the single strongest predictor of an adult's income level is not their IQ, their academic performance in school, or even their personal work ethic. It is, quite simply, their parents' socio-economic level. This stark reality fundamentally contradicts the school's pervasive meritocratic narrative, the comforting story that promises upward mobility solely through individual performance. Nietzsche, with chilling foresight, precisely identified this dynamic as a manifestation of slave morality. A value system meticulously constructed to convince subordinates that their subordination, their very position at the bottom of the hierarchy, is not merely acceptable, but just and even natural. In his searing critique, on the genealogy of morality, He unmasked how seemingly noble ideals often function as sophisticated instruments to perpetuate existing power relations. The subtle, yet brutal, transmutation of systemic structural inequality into a perceived lack of individual merit represents one of modernity's most effective psychological operations. It artfully transforms what should be fundamental questions of social justice into mere matters of personal responsibility, cunningly redirecting resentment from the oppressive structures themselves towards the individual, who is then left to bear the weight of their own failures. Foucault, expanding on this analysis, brilliantly demonstrated how the very concept of normality functions as a potent disciplinary mechanism. The school simultaneously establishes precise norms, behavioral, intellectual, social, and then, with surgical precision, identifies deviations. It creates categories: problematic, inattentive, learning disabled, gifted. This relentless process of categorization, diagnosis, and normalization becomes a pervasive form of social control. The timing of this disciplinary apparatus is crucial. Historically, the expansion of standardized schooling and the rise of credentialism precisely coincide with moments when previously excluded groups, women, racial minorities, the working classes, finally gained access to educational institutions. Credential inflation, the increasing requirement of diplomas and certifications for positions that previously did not demand them, operates as a sophisticated, almost invisible, mechanism for maintaining social hierarchies, all under the seductive guise of mythology lies a revealing, almost cruel, contradiction. While we endlessly celebrate the exceptional, heartwarming stories of upward mobility, the janitor's child who became a renowned surgeon, the immigrant woman who built a thriving company from nothing, these narratives function precisely to legitimize a system where such trajectories remain statistically, heartbreakingly, rare. The truly exceptional is presented as proof of the universally possible, obscuring the uncomfortable truth, that the true, unstated function of the educational system is not to facilitate universal mobility, but to skillfully manage aspirations within carefully defined parameters that preserve the existing social structure. So, how are potentially free citizens transformed into permanent, often willing, servants of the economy? The chillingly modern answer: structural indebtedness. What Nietzsche, in On the Genealogy of Morality, identified as the primordial relationship between creditor and debtor, has evolved and mutated into the central, most pervasive mechanism of contemporary social discipline. Foucault, analyzing this evolution, would observe that social control has subtly migrated from crude physical chains to financial ones, less visible, far more totalizing, and profoundly internalized. Student debt represents the most perfect manifestation of this strategy. It transforms the very pursuit of knowledge, of self-improvement, into a lifelong economic obligation. It manufactures, by design, entire generations of graduates whose career choices, residential decisions, reproductive options, and even their political stances are constrained, sometimes irrevocably, by the primary, existential need to generate income for their creditors. The relationship between student debt and labor discipline is direct, visceral, and undeniable. When a recent graduate carries substantial debt, their ability to reject exploitative working conditions, to question authoritarian structures within their workplace, or to dedicate themselves to socially necessary but financially unlucrative causes, is severely, almost fatally, compromised. This is not some accidental consequence of how educational funding is structured. It is, in fact, precisely its intended function, to produce workers who cannot afford to disobey. As Foucault would observe, the most effective disciplinary power is not that exercised against the subject's will, but that which fundamentally restructures the very conditions under which the will itself amplifies its disciplinary efficacy to an almost cruel degree. Nietzsche observed that the pain of debt lasts 10, 20 years, the memory that burns itself into the flesh. The student debt system extends this horizon for decades, capturing not only the debtor's present but colonizing their entire future. This relentless colonization of the future represents what we can call, adapting Foucauldian concepts, temporal biopolitical control, power exerted not just over bodies in the present, but over their entire trajectories through time. Many student debtors report the surreal, almost Kafkaesque experience of continuing to pay off their own educational debts while simultaneously starting to save for their children's education, intergenerationally perpetuating this grim cycle of debt discipline. Ironically, the very system that creates this debt servitude presents it as an investment in human capital. Language that, with chilling precision, inadvertently reveals the raw truth. Debt-financed education literally transforms the human being into capital, the person into a financial asset whose future value will be extracted for decades. This is not a flaw in the system. It is its central, ingenious, and devastating function, to produce subjects who, as Nietzsche predicted, live with the perpetual feeling of duty, of an inescapable personal obligation. Student debt thus represents the exemplary case of what Foucault would call a biopolitical technology, a mechanism that manages and controls life itself, not through direct force, but through the subtle manipulation of its very conditions. This deep dive into the philosophy of education, viewed through the lenses of Nietzsche and Foucault and touched by the shadow of Marx's critique of modern capitalism, reveals how the educational system fulfills its undeclared function, to produce workers who accept the alienation of their time, their energy, and their profound creative potential as not only inevitable, but even virtuous. The unofficial motto of the system becomes brutally clear: work, pay bills, die. The Marxist concept of alienation gains deep, almost existential, psychological dimensions when examined through the penetrating eyes of Nietzsche and Foucault. It is no longer just about the separation between the worker and the product they create, it becomes a fundamental existential fragmentation. The typical modern worker, 1. Performs tasks whose greater purpose they do not fully comprehend. Operates within organizations whose crucial decisions they do not significantly influence. Produces results whose primary benefits flow not to them, but to others. All in exchange for resources that barely sustain their work-oriented existence. It is not merely economic, it is ontological. It affects not just how one lives, but who one fundamentally is. The educational system systematically prepares us for this alienation, training us in the lessons necessary to become functional, obedient workers for the current economic paradigm. Nietzsche, in his searing critique of the last man, those who invented standardized happiness but lost the capacity to authentically create their own values, precisely identified this domestication of human will as the supreme triumph of industrial society. He wrote, "They work, for work is entertainment. But they take care lest the entertainment be too exhausting." This observation perfectly captures the contemporary condition where alienated labor is cleverly repackaged as a career, professional growth, or skill development, euphemisms that mask the fundamental absence of autonomy, intrinsic purpose, and genuine connection to productive activity. Foucault would expand this analysis, demonstrating how modern disciplinary power does not operate primarily through prohibition, "Thou shalt not," but through production, specifically, the production of certain types of subjects. The educational economic system doesn't just restrict possibilities, it actively produces individuals who desire their own productive participation, who internalize the ethics of alienated labor as a personal virtue. The true triumph of this system is when the individual experiences as a personal choice what fundamentally represents structural determination. The culmination of this process is the pervasive contemporary phenomenon of professional identity, the complete, often unquestioned, fusion between what one does to survive economically and who one fundamentally is. When people define themselves primarily through their alienated work, I'm an accountant, I'm a marketing manager, it signals a profound, almost tragic, surrender of the self to the economic apparatus. To truly escape this invisible cage, to begin the profound process of liberation, requires what Nietzsche called the transvaluation of all values. A radical questioning, not just of specific practices, but of the very values, the very assumptions, that sustain them. Applied to the educational economic context, this transvaluation begins with fundamental, disarming questions. What truly constitutes a life well lived? What types of knowledge and capabilities are genuinely valuable, regardless of their immediate market worth? What forms of education could cultivate full, thriving human beings, not just productive approach with what he called practices of freedom, forms of self-formation that do not completely reject existing institutions, but work strategically within and against them to create new subjective possibilities. This can manifest in educational practices through critical pedagogies that simultaneously transmit necessary knowledge to navigate the existing system while developing the profound capacity to question its foundations. Paulo Freire, a pedagogical translator of Foucauldian insights, described this approach as being in the system while not being of the system, a nuanced stance that avoids both naive, utopian rejection and uncritical, compliant acceptance. Concretely, educational resistance technologies can include creating third spaces for learning outside formal institutions, community workshops, peer-to-peer collectives, open-source knowledge initiatives. It involves practicing epistemic disobedience that questions established hierarchies of knowledge, daring to learn what the system doesn't validate. It means developing hidden curricula that teach critical tools and subversive histories within conventional structures, often through informal networks. And crucially, it involves forming horizontal learning communities that prefigure non-hierarchical, truly collaborative educational relationships. These are not abstract theories. These are active, daily practices. Beyond formal education, reclaiming our relationship with time becomes a profoundly radical act. Both formal education and alienated labor are fundamentally based on the commodification of human time, its division into discrete, measurable units that can be sold, bought, managed, and optimized for profit. Resisting this temporal logic can involve practices like slow learning, educational approaches that prioritize depth, contemplation, and genuine understanding over speed, frantic memorization, and credential accumulation. It means experimenting with alternative forms of labor that reject the linear equation between time and monetary value, exploring models like gift economies, time banks, or skill sharing. And perhaps most powerfully, it means deliberately cultivating what ancient philosophers called contemplative leisure, time not instrumentalized for production or consumption, but dedicated purely to reflection, to deep connection with self and others, to integral human resistance do not represent a unified political program or a definitive utopia, but rather, a diverse set of experimental practices. As Foucault would emphasize, there is no privileged viewpoint outside power relations from which we can perfectly redesign the social system. There is, however, a constant, exhilarating possibility of problematization, the relentless questioning of aspects of social reality previously accepted as natural, as inevitable. This problematization opens up spaces for what Nietzsche called philosophizing with a hammer, not mere destruction, but a precise testing of the soundness of existing structures, identifying the cracks through which new possibilities can emerge. The true challenge is not merely escaping the rat race. It is fundamentally reimagining the very relationships between knowledge, work, and human life itself. Both Nietzsche and Foucault understood that a purely negative critique, though absolutely necessary, remains insufficient. The destructive moment, the smashing of idols, must be complemented by a powerful creative impulse. An impulse that Nietzsche associated with the innocence of becoming and Foucault with the aesthetics of existence. This reinvention begins not with abstract institutional reforms, but with a profound, personal reintegration of our activities into a more holistic understanding of human flourishing. As Nietzsche suggested in Schopenhauer as educator, the fundamental purpose of education should be to free the philosopher within us, not in the narrow, professional sense, but as a universal capacity for radical questioning and the creation of values. Work, similarly, can be reconceptualized not as the alienated commodification of human time, but as an expression of the inherent creative capacity that Nietzsche called the will to power in its affirmative, life-affirming sense. Such a reconceptualization requires a fundamental distinction between work as self-directed production, an activity that transforms the world and the self, and employment as subordination to external economic imperatives. The central question becomes not how do I find a good job, but how do I develop forms of work that simultaneously sustain my life and express my unique human potentials. This distinction opens up vast possibilities for experimenting with cooperative, intermittent, or primarily non-market value relationships, the progressive linearity of education followed by the cyclical repetition of alienated labor, can be replaced by what we might call, adapting Foucauldian concepts, heterochronies, alternative temporalities where learning, production, and contemplation are not segregated into distinct life stages, but integrated into rhythms that truly respond to developmental and circumstantial needs. This temporal reintegration allows education to become a lifelong process, not solely directed towards productive ends, and allows work to incorporate dimensions of continuous learning and experimentation, not subordinated to immediate efficiency. The relationship with technology represents a crucial dimension of this reinvention. Automation and artificial intelligence, currently implemented primarily to intensify the extraction of surplus value, contain a radically different potential, to free human time from instrumental labor needs. This potential, however, will only be realized through political struggles over the distribution of productivity gains. As Foucault understood, technologies are never neutral, they embody and reinforce specific power relations. The question is not whether we implement advanced technologies, but in service of which values and social configurations. Perhaps the deepest dimension of this reinvention is the reconsideration of the very concept of value itself. The current educational economic system is based on an artificial scarcity. Grades, credentials, jobs, and financial rewards are deliberately limited to create perpetual competition. A Nietzschean Foucauldian approach fundamentally questions this scarcity, recognizing it not as a natural fact, but as a specific social construction. The abundance of knowledge, the inherent capacity for cooperation, and the vast productive capacity that exists today could underpin radically different forms of social organization, ones not based on competitive scarcity, but on collaborative and abstract utopia or some revolutionary blueprint waiting to be implemented. It is, instead, a guiding horizon for concrete experimentation. As Foucault would emphasize, there is no perfect society waiting to be implemented from a predetermined plan. There is, however, a constant possibility of problematization, the relentless questioning of aspects of social reality previously accepted as natural or inevitable. This problematization opens up those crucial spaces for what Nietzsche called philosophizing with a hammer, not mere destruction, but a precise testing of the soundness of existing structures, identifying the cracks through which genuinely new possibilities can emerge. Now that you know the true, hidden function of the educational economic system, the crucial question remains: will you continue running unconsciously on the hamster wheel? Or will you begin to consciously build alternative paths? Before we conclude, what aspect of your relationship with education, work, or money needs to be radically rethought in light of this understanding? If this knowledge resonated deeply with you, write in the comments, "I'm out of the race." Share this video with someone who desperately needs this reflection. Leave a like, and subscribe to receive more content like this. See you in the next video.